Major funding for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
The fiscal cliff, federal sequestration, the Great Recession. If these concepts don't strike fear in the hearts of those that operate and live in the philanthropic and humanitarian world, it does at least cause grave concern. Hello, I'm Chris William, and you are logged into the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy. On this edition, how do all the aforementioned challenges change the strategic vision and direction of this very important industry we refer to as philanthropy and nonprofit? And how does it alter the effectiveness of agencies and organizations that supply services and support in charitable and the softer social sciences? Or maybe more plainly, what happens to our community's safety nets given the stark new fiscal reality? We will begin the broader discussion in just a moment.
Major funding also by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded January 25th, 2013. On this week's program, Mac Bennett of United Way of the Midlands, Rand Coble of the North Carolina Center for Public Policy Research, David Heinen of the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, and Russell Stahl of Greenville Forward.
Hello, welcome to our program. Gentlemen, welcome. Good to have you all here. Rand, I'm going to start with you because I want to, and you're right there. You know, we hear so much. Last year, everyone was worried. Individual taxpayers were, of course, concerned about, taxes going up. We're going to front-end load a whole bunch of things. We want to get, companies were paying special dividends out before 2013. It seemed like many individuals were trying to get larger charitable contributions in a year that they knew they could get the deduction. Let's start with this 2% of the top wage earners. Are they concerned? Have you seen a major drop? Is there a substantial change in the way that they are going to be giving going forward?
Yeah, I think so. Let's just sort of think about all the money that nonprofits give and where it comes from. The biggest amount of money that goes to nonprofits comes from fees for services, particularly if you're not dealing with poor people and you're doing something else, economic development, environment, any number of things, education. Then the second biggest piece for nonprofits is government. That's about 31% of the total pie. Philanthropy is only 14% of the total amount going to nonprofits. And then of that 14%, 75%, 3/4 of the money, comes from individuals. And so that's where this tax debate really connects, because the individuals are looking at things like the charitable deduction on their income taxes, or in North Carolina, nonprofits are exempt from state sales tax. The other money in philanthropy comes from foundations, about 13%, and then corporations are about 5%. And so I think sometimes the public gets sort of mixed up in where does the money come from for nonprofits, but fee for services, biggest amount, then the other half is divided between government and philanthropy.
So not to overstate it and not to minimize it either, but do you lose sleep at night worrying about that particular sector?
Just taking my own personal experience for the last 3 years. For that first year in the Great Recession, we saw a lot of foundations freezing their grant making. I mean, you might have a grant proposal pending, they froze it. The total assets, because they work from an average, are down for most foundations. Corporate giving almost just went, it was down at a sharp angle. I would say the individuals for us kept giving, but it was much harder to get new donors or to get individuals to increase their funding. And different nonprofits are more impacted. You know, for 4 years of budget cutting at the state government level, a lot of nonprofits depending on state government to serve poor people or education or hospitals or whatever.
Mac, I want to go to you because you're pretty close to closing out your fundraising campaign down in the Midlands. What has Rand said that either rings true or maybe not for you?
Let me just add one thing. The critical thing about individual giving, even though it's a smaller portion, is it's unrestricted. All of these other funds are coming with restrictions placed on them. Government service contracts, foundation grants, they're all tied to a service that you've got to provide. Yeah. The individual gift is unrestricted, so the nonprofit can usually, not always, but usually, so the nonprofit can use those as it best sees fit. So those are very important dollars. We're seeing, it's sporadic as the way that we're seeing larger givers. We've lost some, but we're also seeing increases with our larger givers too. I think what's hurting a lot of our campaign, 70% of our campaign is payroll deduction in the companies, blue collar, the wage earners, the 30 to 70,000 a year wage earner. And what's hurt them this year has been the 2% Social Security coming back on, having a chunk out of their checks each pay period. So we're struggling with not only the large donors reacting to the uncertainty in the fiscal and financial markets, but also, everybody took a 2% pay cut as the way they see it that was imposed on them January 1st.
David, what do you think?
Well, my sense is that many individual givers are choosing to give to fewer organizations and maybe focusing their philanthropy on fewer. We've seen that in North Carolina, each of the last years, half or more of nonprofits say they've received fewer individual contributions than they'd received the previous year. So that's half on top of half on top of half. So that's the majority of nonprofits are getting less in individual giving, even though overall individual giving is only down about 11% from pre-recession levels. So I do think that it's really becoming more focused, picking your favorite one or two nonprofits to give to those. Some individuals are focusing more on human services organizations, things that are really part of the safety net, seeing that there's still a tremendous need there and focusing on that to the exclusion of others. So I think there's a trickle-down effect on other organizations.
Yeah. And Chris, you asked what keeps us awake at night, and of all the things that we deal with, the sustainability and giving is the issue that keeps us awake. I've seen giving change.
Sustainability in what way?
And bringing money in. And bringing contributions
sustainability,
in.
The business model that are not-for-profit.
Yep. And we've seen our corporate giving as director of a small nonprofit, our corporate giving has dropped dramatically. But our individual giving has actually gone up. And I think part of that is because we've gotten smarter. We've asked, and the way of asking for money now has changed so dramatically than what it used to be even 5 years ago. There's much more accountability we have to have. We have to show results. We have to be real responsive to the donor and report back to them on how we're making a difference with their money.
So Rand, I want to go back to, because you kind of outlined the pie, a third of this way, 14% from individuals. So when you look at
philanthropy.
From philanthropy.
3/4 of philanthropy.
I stand corrected. So when you look at the total income stream, you look at federal dollars, you look at state dollars, you look at all of these things, clearly the matrix has shifted, but has the total amount of dollars gone down? Has the industry shrunk from a total revenue standpoint?
You probably know that better than I.
It hasn't, actually. In North Carolina,
it has not?
It is not. No, in fact, it's grown. We're a $38 billion industry in 2010, the last year when we've got good data from the IRS, which is it's grown about an average of 14% a year in the last decade. So even after the recession, it's been growing at about 12% a year.
But the flip side, Chris, is the demand for services, which has gone way up.
Yeah, the demand for services.
Because of the Great Recession.
Exactly. 93% of nonprofits last year in North Carolina said that they had an increase in demand for services. 58% said they couldn't meet that demand. So, you know, even as the total revenue is growing, the demand is growing at a much greater rate, and you know, which means that 40% of nonprofits operated at a deficit last year, for example.
Well, and they can't sustain that, unlike a commercial enterprise.
That goes back to Russell's point.
Yep.
And we've seen, when you look at North and South Carolina combined, nonprofits have $1 trillion in revenue. And we've seen the number of nonprofits has exploded over the last 5 years. In Greenville County, for example, we've gone from 1,900 nonprofits 5 years ago. Now we have about 2,500. So, and I don't know the reason for that. Most of them are small, but we've seen a great growth in nonprofits. Revenues probably have remained pretty stable.
Now that's interesting. So you have people that are laid off that are starting nonprofits. Is this a trend or is this an anomaly? Does this challenge the way that the nonprofit business model has worked?
I think that's been going on for the last 5 or 6 years.
Or even before. The trend in nonprofit growth, this for the probably last couple of decades, it's been the only, of the three sectors of our economy, it's been the only one that's really been growing in jobs and revenues. So it's a trend. It's not just brought on by the recession.
In North Carolina, and not long ago on this program, we had Senator Bob Rucho, who's the point of the spear for the Republicans, to get some tax reform done in North Carolina. If that's the case and they get what they want, deductions would be at risk. It would seem like some of the monies that go from state coffers to nonprofits for services would be at risk. Am I overplaying that? How critical would that be for the philanthropic and the nonprofit sector?
No, I think you're exactly right, and I think both components of that are really critical for the nonprofits and a real concern. If tax exemption goes away, or if for many types of nonprofits, the museums, they charge admission fees, nonprofits provide childcare, it would really fundamentally alter their business model and make it harder for them to be able to provide the level of services if their services are taxed. You know, likewise for almost every nonprofit, if they're not fully tax exempt, you know, as nonprofits are in North Carolina and most other states, it's going to fundamentally alter the business model.
So Rand, is the specter, and you know, we all talk about, gosh, it's the safety net. Many agencies are the safety net. Is the specter of that greater than the actual reality of that, or
it's a pretty scary time to be in the nonprofit sector, mainly because you've got things happening at the federal level and the state level. And so Congress is talking about two things: eliminating the charitable deduction. That scares us. Second, they're talking about putting a cap on the amount of charitable donations that you can make and have it be tax deductible. That's scary. So that's just the federal side. At the state level, in your program with Senator Rucho, he's talking about abolishing the personal income tax, which is 53% of the total budget. So out of a $20 billion budget, that's 53% alone. He's talking about abolishing the corporate income tax, which is 6% of the total state revenue. And so what he wants to do is then raise the sales tax, and what they say, the phrase they use is broaden the base and lower the rates. And by that, he wants to extend sales tax to all kinds of services in North Carolina. Well, nonprofits provide services. It could be housing. It could be child care. You know, so are those going to be now taxed as services? What if at the same time you eliminate the charitable deduction and give people, you know, a disincentive, or they don't have the same incentive to make charitable gifts? And so the combination of those things, you've got an incentive to not give as much to nonprofits from a wealthy person's point of view. You're maybe paying more tax if you're a nonprofit providing services, and the demand for your services, more poor people coming in the door, food banks, you know, are having to, instead of just go get it from the grocery stores and redistribute it, they're having to recruit gifts of food now in a way they didn't before. And so that's that's bullets coming from three directions.
Yeah, well, and in Richland County, in Lexington, in Casey, in Irmo, in all those places that are in your area of dominant influence down there, Mac, I got to think, you know, would the same thing apply? Do you have that safety net that's tenuous, and if you can't provide it, then where's the next stop down on the ladder? I mean, how does that work out in places like that?
Like the Harvest Hope Food Bank, which is the major food bank provider in South Carolina, their services are up, and have been up, going up 15, 20, 30% for the last 4 or 5 years, and we're not seeing a decline in those things. You know, you almost fear that the nonprofits are creating an entitlement class that the government struggled with years ago. So it's a problem. And getting back to the sustainability issue, as services go up and revenues shrink or become more challenging to provide for these organizations, it's creating a real challenge for the organization.
So, well, to take it a little bit further, then what happens, the safety nets being one thing, but what happens to the innovation? What happens to the grants that are made from nonprofits? I mean, you could take that a little bit further and say, well, this whole sector's at risk.
We have to be extremely creative. And
wait a minute, I'm sorry, Russell, let me interrupt you. Are we overplaying that? When you look at what you're trying to do versus what the rest of the state's doing commercially even, would you say that, yeah, we're not really that important?
As a nonprofit, you have to differentiate yourself from others. And when we look at, I mean, I personally hope that we increase the size of the pie instead of worrying about the size of the slice that you're getting as a nonprofit. And an interesting thing has happened, I think, when we look at the economy. I was hoping that we'd see some consolidation. I was hoping we'd see nonprofits merge. That hadn't happened. But we have seen a lot more collaboration of nonprofits. A lot more grants are written with two nonprofits teaming together that historically have not. And that's been a great thing. So that's an example of some of the innovation that we're seeing on giving, especially in foundation.
I want to come back to something you said, Rand, and ask you about it in just a second around this whole idea of charitable and how the public feels about that. Before we do that, just a reminder, or to tell you to begin with, on February 19th, and if this program is actually being broadcast after February 19th, you can watch it on our website. February 19th, we are hosting the CBR South Carolina Education Summit. It is at the main studios of ETV in Columbia. It will include a stellar list, what I think is a stellar list. He is the Secretary of Education in South Carolina, Dr. Mick Zase. Along with him, Gilda Cobb-Hunter, representative from Orangeburg County. Also, Dr. Rainey Knight is a superintendent. I love that name. I love Rainey Knight's name. Dr. Rainey Knight from Darlington County, also the Superintendent of the Year last year in South Carolina. Trip Dubard from South Carolina Future Minds, and chairs the South Carolina Chamber, as well as on the State Board of Education, among other things. Mike Brennan, the president of BB&T, will be on that program. It is February 19th. If you'd like to join us, you can. Go to carolinabusinessreview.com, or you can watch the program there. Rand, I want to come back to this idea that, you talked about, we talked about charitable giving. And deductions and itemized deductions and what happens to charitable giving if there is a set pool of money and people choose to take their itemized deductions on their, for instance, their mortgage interest, and then what happens to the charity side? How does the public feel about that type of?
Well, I've been looking at polls on this, and it's not like nonprofits get polled the same way Congress or the legislature or the governor does. But I take this great publication called the Polling Report that sort of sifts through and sort of picks the legitimate polls and then does a lot of them on particular topics. The public is really supportive of the nonprofit sector and the different tax measures that affect it. I was actually surprised by the results. One measure, during the fiscal cliff negotiations, the public was asked about a lot of things that are really still in play. And they were asked, do you favor or oppose eliminating the charitable deduction? And 69% said they opposed that. And the numbers there were even higher for nonprofits than the home mortgage deduction, which was shocking to me. Then when they were asked about this idea that's flowing in Congress about putting a cap on the amount of deductibility for all charitable giving, the public also was over 50% in opposing that. And so that's a reservoir of support that I think the nonprofit sector has for the things that it does in our state and in our country. Whether it's providing human services. My parents, even at 80 years old, were delivering Meals on Wheels, and they said, well, we need to help out the old folks. And I said, well, what are you? And, it can be that. It can be community development. David mentioned the art museums. David and I work more in public policy type organizations. His work is broader than just that. But, you know, that's an important function in our society, and I think the public understands the importance of it, and it shows up in those polls.
David, you know, Russell made the point that he was surprised that there weren't a lot more consolidations in the industry, broadly in the industry. Are you surprised by that? Do you have statistics on that, or?
We know that you know, as Russell says, in South Carolina, there are relatively few mergers. We've heard, you know, we hear of some. I think more are looking at collaboration. Part of it is really funder driven. So foundations really do look at collaboration and are asking, you know, nonprofits to work together more, if not necessarily to merge. You know, to think about ways that they can share resources, find the common ground between what they're doing, and really maximize the impact of the private money that they're getting for that.
And you know, something else came up in this whole dialogue, but not necessarily with you all before the program, but as we're talking among the production staff. In South Carolina, and specifically down in the Charleston area, Daniel Island to be exact, there's a company called Blackbaud. And I know you all heard of it. They produce software for nonprofits. They lay off 150 people within the last month. They lay off their CEO. He's gone. So I'm assuming that's not an anomaly, Russell. I'm assuming there are a lot more stories about commercial enterprises that are not nonprofits that are attached to the industry sector.
I would think so. But I really don't have a lot of information about that. I just don't know the answer.
Mac, are there other? I'm not asking you to pinpoint examples, but I mean, does that surprise you? I mean, Blackbaud
I don't know what the deal is with Blackbaud.
Well, and I'm not asking you to take a shot or make a comment about Blackbaud, but that was Blackbaud in Charleston was the darling. I mean, they would point to it and say, there's one of our economic development successes. And the fact that here is a company that is feeling the same pain, if not worse, than what the nonprofit
serves the nonprofit community. I think it's more economics of things and competition. And you know, we're seeing that in the private sector too. Bose, we lose 200 jobs with the Bose plant in Columbia. We lose another, but we're also bringing in some things. Amazon and Nephron Pharmaceuticals, and Michelin's got a big expansion going. So those are the things that we really need to focus on, and the employment that they're going to create.
I do think that there is a trickle-down effect, though. You know, as I mentioned before, as 40% of nonprofits were operating at a deficit last year, and a third had to cut staff last year. You know, those contracts that they have and the business that they provide to some of those service providers who really have focused on the nonprofit sector, nonprofits are having to make hard decisions, and you know, they're having to do a lot more with a lot less, and some of that, you know, is going to have a trickle-down effect on the business community as it's serving nonprofits. You know,
there's a term, at least in the for-profit world, and they call that creative destruction. Is that what's going on in the nonprofit sector?
Well, there's been a lot of expansion in the nonprofit. You know, we're competing with each other. I mean, for the dollars and for the human resources to run them. And
so, Mac, wouldn't you guess that there's got to be consolidation somewhere along in here?
Absolutely. And I know there's been an effort in Charlotte, there's been an effort in Columbia, but it is hard to get. That's the one thing that the nonprofit sector doesn't follow the corporate model very well.
Why
it's
not?
Hard. Well, it's a different governing structure. When you buy a company out, you're purchasing the asset, and you've got power to do that. It doesn't quite. Power's not seated in the same place in the nonprofit sector.
There's several differences why you don't see that, and then I want to go back to what really we also see.
And we have about a minute left, not even.
One is a lot of funding is for project. Well, that's not conducive to people wanting to get together, because that's not something that you can go cross organizations and then cut it off after a while. The other thing is merging cultures. I mean, think of all these bank mergers we've seen here in Charlotte and other places. That's difficult to do, and nonprofit cultures are even smart, because our bottom line is not just a financial bottom line. It's credibility in the community. It's public benefit. It's all the things that make the public want to support that with their money.
You know, given the wealth of knowledge at this table, I really hate to cut you off, because we're just getting some traction, but I'm going to have to. Thank you for being on the program. Nice to have you here, Rand, again. Yes. Dave, I hope as being a rookie, it wasn't too painful, but thank you for come back, please. Russell, nice to see you. Good to see you. And Matt, good luck in the rest of your.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you. Till next week, I'm Chris Woody.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by The Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.